Let's go back in time. The year's 2020. Things are looking pretty good. And then, COVID. People went crazy in COVID. I mean, absolutely nuts. I am convinced that we are still dealing with the fallout of COVID and how it was handled. It traumatized world economies, it ripped apart liberties, generated widespread distrust in government institutions, and it killed a lot of people. I think it's uncontroversial to say that certain demographics were especially vulnerable. I mean, the old people in particular. And one of the shameful tragedies was how, in so many Democrat states, they sent old people that they knew were infected right back into the nursing homes to infect more of the people who were known to be vulnerable. People say that, oh, we didn't know that much about COVID in those early months, but we did know that the old were especially vulnerable. I mention this because instead of focusing on protecting these people, the ones we had already determined were most vulnerable to COVID, there were widespread actions targeting entire populations. Young, healthy, middle-aged, it didn't matter. They shut down schools. They locked people in their homes. They declared that millions of people were not essential. They put countless small businesses out of business forever. My own small business was crushed because of the handling of COVID. I still have it, but it's been on life support throughout the entirety of the Biden administration. Of course, the giant corporations like Amazon and Walmart, they did great. They benefited immensely from the forced elimination of countless smaller competitors, many of whom have still not recovered. This is actually one of the knock-on effects that I'm referring to that we're still living with, because even though they browbeat us with assertions that the economy was thriving, small businesses, which still form a giant part of the economy, knew better. In fact, just today I was speaking with the manager of a pretty large business actually, and he said here in November 2024, the business was just now starting to pick up. These people voted for Trump as if their lives depended on it, which, from my own vantage point, seems entirely plausible. Who knows? Maybe if it had been handled more intelligently, other aspects of the Democrat platform would have won out, and maybe Harris would actually have won. It's worth reflecting on those first few months again, back in 2020, because I think they set in motion huge societal forces which we have not yet seen the end of. So, do you remember 15 days to flatten the curve? I do. Now, I knew it was a lie the second it came out of their mouths. Why? Because I remembered what the public health people did just a few years before that, when there was an outbreak of the measles. First in California, then in New York. The measly measles. You may not remember this, but even then, they were trying to lock people in their homes for the measles. They also tried to force people to get the measles vaccine or face a $1,000 fine for the measles. Now, court cases eventually ruled against a lot of that, but the point is they tried it. I have links in the description in case you don't remember these events. So the idea that people like this would tolerate anything less than a total shutdown of the entire universe was absurd. If you were surprised at how the public health community handled COVID, you just weren't paying attention. But that also is one of my points. A lot more people are paying attention today. They saw Fauci get rich. They saw the vaccines pretty much fail, requiring 3 million boosters. Long story short, there is a reason why RFK Jr. is being nominated to be the HHS secretary. It has a lot to do with people wising up to the public health industrial complex, which has much more to do with power and riches for Big Pharma and its acolytes than it actually does with the health for the public. So the 15 days to flatten the curve was instantly denounced as not being enough time. Don't you remember how patriotically all Americans went along with this 15 days thing? Even though I knew it was a complete deception, even I was willing to cut the elite status some slack. I don't know if I remember anyone protesting the 15 days to flatten the curve thing. So, how long did they need? Don't you remember? There was talk already that there would have to be significant pandemic measures until a magic potion, vaccine, was made available. Here's a quote from an article. One public health expert said social distancing should be enforced until a vaccine is developed in 12 to 18 months. This was already just in March of 2020. They already knew that they would have to enforce their pandemic measures for more than a year, if not longer. Of course, in the real world, developing a vaccine and taking the time to show that it works and that it doesn't do more harm than good doesn't just take 18 months, it takes years and years. But Trump, to his credit, or to his blame, instituted Operation Warp Speed, and we did get the vaccines pretty quickly. In any case, they were already talking about how they would need much longer than a year before we could get back to normal. It started to become clear to many people that the powers that be had no intention of easing the pandemic measures for years. This was already becoming evident in April and May of 2020 when states began imposing lockdown measures. Depending on what state you were in, you could literally be arrested merely for going out for a walk on your own. There's this famous video of a guy paddleboarding alone out in the ocean being arrested. We could go on and on with such examples. And in America, at least, we are thankful that we didn't have to deal with the fascists in Australia who built concentration camps to deal with COVID. I don't think they use it too extensively, or I would have heard about it, but that's just nuts. So, 15 days to flatten the curve in March of 2020 quickly turned into emergency lockdown order after lockdown order across the United States throughout the month of April. Some governors, like Governor Evers in Wisconsin, a Democrat so-called, tried to cancel the spring election in Wisconsin. Can you believe it? Canceling an election! Canceling the democratic process. The Wisconsin Supreme Court told him to F himself. That's a good illustration of the absolute craziness of the time, when governors, granted some Republicans also, and county governments practically ejaculated over themselves whenever they came up with a new way to restrict people from their everyday life, for their own good, of course. Because, people, they're just too stupid to manage their own risks. Now, before we go on, it's possible that you are one of the people that think we did not do enough. If that's you, well, okay. But it's worth mentioning that whether you like it or not, the vast majority of Americans are of the view that you lost your shit and went completely out of your mind. As evidence, I submit again, the re-election of Donald J. Trump and RFK Jr.'s endorsement of Trump as a Democrat, and soon, pretty soon, coming up, the HHS Secretary. If you want any chance whatsoever to be considered credible, you will have to find a way to reframe your perspectives in a way that is not patently insulting and offensive, like saying, trust the science, and expecting 100% compliance with whatever comes after uttering that sentence. Since, actually, you are a nutjob and your views are stupid, there probably isn't any way you can make yourself credible again. But I am willing to be open-minded to any argument put forward in good faith that relies on evidence and not derision. And that's all I have to say about that.
And that's all I have to say about that.
So, by May of 2020, the battle lines were shaping up. Michigan saw one of the first major protests, which featured the tried and true technique of the elites, where they mocked the protesters for not caring about the health of their fellow man. The protesters, of course, selfish bastards that they were watching their lives and livelihoods being stripped away on specious legal grounds for a disease which by then was already known to be most dangerous to a very specific subpopulation, the old people. Everyone else had a pretty good chance of being just fine, as long as they didn't go to the hospital and subject themselves to remdesivir. I wanted to gather up a bunch of examples of the scorn and contempt that was poured over the heads of people who formerly had pretty decent lives, but because they were deemed non-essential, were having their jobs destroyed, their kids taken out of schools, and being locked down, by all appearance, forever. This contempt was represented in numerous media reports, but you can find them on your own. But some of the best ones were in the comment sections, or of course that bastion of sanity, Reddit. So they were not very easy to find with some searches as I tried to create this video. But I think you remember. Now, if it had only stayed in such places, the comment sections of news articles, perhaps we could just shrug it off. But there were still plenty of people who believed all of that. So unfortunately, it overflowed into personal interactions within the community. For example, I had an uncle try to dunk on me for not getting vaccinated. And when I told him that the vaccine didn't actually prevent people from getting the vaccine, this was complete news to him. In fact, he didn't believe me at all. He thought I was just making it up. The only thing he knew was that I was a bad person who must hate people because I was not willing to subject myself to a novel product that had not been safety tested and was already known, if one was even modestly informed, of course, to be ineffective. Incidentally, I've never gotten a COVID vaccine. I may have gotten COVID, it's hard to say, because as you may have forgotten, the COVID tests were eventually withdrawn by the FDA as being faulty, once again giving testament to the absolute incompetency of our federal bureaucracies. I tested positive once for what that is worth, but I do know a fair number of people who have gotten the vaccine and suffered from serious elements, but I digress. The battle lines were drawn. There were the good guys, the people who wore the masks, stayed indoors, ordered dutifully from Amazon, and fully trusted that their government would make sure that they didn't starve to death. Perhaps you forget how farmers were destroying their own crops because the logistical system which brought the crops to the consumers were not considered essential. Thank you, government elites. You are so smart. This was going to be the state of things indefinitely. Remember, at this time, they were talking as though life was going to be just like this until after a vaccine was available. And this was, at minimum, going to be a year. Many expected it would be much longer than that because, well, in a sane world, before you unleash a vaccine on the market, you have to take time to do long-term studies on it to make sure it doesn't kill you, cause cancer or birth defects or whatever. At the time, we didn't know yet just how insane these people would be putting vaccines on the markets without any of those kinds of studies that utilize completely brand new technologies and completely foregoing all of the long-term safety studies. So anyway, at minimum, in the middle of May of 2020, we were looking at being locked into our homes, slowly dying for a year, with those of us who were better informed knowing it would likely be much longer than that. Governments around the world, with the exception of Sweden, were climbing over each other to think of new ways to freak out on their own populations, regardless of any considerations about the supply chain, the impact on the poor, and naturally individual liberty was tossed out the door. Any mention of such things would instantly get you treated like a leper who deserved all the scorn that could be heaped on you. In fact, they literally wish you were dead. If you would go back through the comment sections during that time period, they actually hoped you would die. Who would rescue us from this body of death? Then, something happened. Someone did die, but not from COVID. No, he died while being arrested in Minneapolis. And whether you think it was because of police brutality or not, this event radically altered the narrative about COVID. Prior to this, the powers that be were making great pains to show that COVID was a disease that threatened all life on Earth. In fact, the sun itself might cease to shine if you did not wear a mask. You selfish bastard, why won't you wear a mask? In my opinion, there were people that thought this was finally the moment to have that civil war that everyone had been talking so long about. The lines of demarcation were shaping up very nicely. You had the business owners and people who worked for a living watching their lives completely upended and destroyed, starting to lash out. And then you had the bureaucrats, the welfare recipients, for whom nothing really changed during COVID, and college kids who were already living in their parents' basements, and so for whom nothing had really changed, ready to cut the throats of those evil protesters putting the public health at risk. Numerous articles were being released that went out of their way to say that it was conservatives who were most stridently opposed to the pandemic measures. This was not completely without merit, but it overlooked the reality that people across all political persuasions were not happy with how things were being handled. It would take some time for those who leaned more to the left to figure out that it was their own left-wingers that were closing their businesses and locking them in their homes. And even now, many of those people would not describe themselves as conservatives, although they did vote for Trump. If you don't buy my theory that they wanted to have their civil war, you can compose your own theory as to why they are pushing it like this. Remember, the data was already showing definitively that the vulnerable person was the old person, and they completely ignored this, and it had to have been for some agenda. So you decide what that agenda was. But the death of George Floyd turned all this on its head. Suddenly, there were mass protests everywhere. Social distancing was out the window. Rioters were standing shoulder to shoulder as they rampaged down streets in bigger cities across the country. And do you think that the public health people condemned this? When people were having poverty thrust upon them, with their jobs being erased and their businesses destroyed, when people rallied at state houses to protest this, the public health establishment called them racist and white nationalists and, above all, selfish. Were the rioters called selfish? You know the answer to that. What actually happened is that the establishment suddenly made excuses for being out in public in mass action. Here's one example from June 2nd, 2020, and again, the link is in the description. Here's the quote. However, while researchers worry about a surge in infection as a result of the demonstrations, some have chosen not to condemn the gatherings, but to encourage demonstrators to take precautions while participating in them. In this way, protesters may not compromise their causes but consolidate their goals. From the same day, another article, link in the description. Here's the headline. Protests defy coronavirus guidelines, but health experts say engagement is essential. Here's how protesters and police can reduce risk. The links to these articles are in the description, and if you've forgotten about this chapter in American history, I strongly recommend you read them, especially the post-present article. We would hear the arguments that fighting racism was more important than fighting the pandemic that entire summer. Remember, according to these people, more than 1 million people died from COVID in the United States. But I assure you, no matter how you count them, the number of black people who died at the hands of police is far, 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 far smaller than 1 million. So again, clearly there's an agenda at work and not reason. But I'm not going to get into those arguments here, because I'm sure you remember what happened then. We had mostly peaceful protests, courtesy of CNN. We had national nightmares like the Rittenhouse event, which took place during similar riots. In Washington, D.C., rioters attacked the White House and actually breached the fence. But hey, that's not an insurrection, is it, yo? As a libertarian-minded, I'm all on board with making sure law enforcement handles situations reasonably and constitutionally, although I think that should apply to people of all races and creeds. Daniel Shaver, anyone? But that's not my point in this video. The point is that all of these riots resulting in the death of George Floyd completely exposed the COVID narrative as just a bunch of hyped up bullshit. After that, it didn't matter how dangerous you said COVID was. COVID could have been weaponized Ebola at that point. But if the public health community and the mainstream press thought it was still okay to march in the streets and burn down city blocks, people would have doubted all the things that they were saying about it even in that scenario. Why should one group of people get to protest but not another? Was COVID only spread by business owners and not by BLM activists? Could the coronavirus tell the difference between a cause that liberals thought was worthy and one that conservatives did? It was nonsense. Something didn't add up. Something was fishy about the whole thing. The death of George Floyd saved the world because it exposed the rank hypocrisy and intellectual dishonesty of the purveyors of pandemic fear porn. Within months, states like Florida and Texas would lift their emergency orders, and you know what? They fared just as well as states like California, which remained absolutely insane for more than a year after that. California didn't lift its emergency order until 2023. That's just a year ago. Most of us had moved on with our lives like halfway through 2021. And I have no doubt that they would have kept their lockdown orders in place far longer than 2022, if not for the fact that places like Florida, with a similar population and population density, were not only not dying, but were thriving. For example, New York went bonkers with its COVID lockdowns, but their death rate per 100,000 was only 397, compared to Florida's 404. That's pretty close. But Texas was at 322. That's a lot less. California was in the 200s, but clearly, if we can trust this data, and I'm more than a little skeptical since they are counting people who died in car accidents as a COVID fatality, it didn't matter what kind of measures you put in place. Whether tight or loose, COVID spread. The difference is that Florida and Texas didn't wreck people's entire lives and livelihoods. How many people would have died from all these COVID measures if George Floyd had not died? It's hard to say. We know, for example, that they were predicting millions dying from starvation due to shutting down farms and the infrastructure needed to get food in the mouths of people. For example, there was this World Food Program officer who said, quote, "We could see 300,000 die a day for several months if we don't handle this right," end quote. But George Floyd did die. And activists went nuts, burning and destroying things. The public health establishment actually endorsed what these maniacs were doing only weeks after condemning and mercilessly whipping so-called conservatives who merely showed up for a protest and burned and destroyed nothing. After this, the noose around America's neck was loosened. America was saved, but so was the world. It should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. I don't wish that Floyd had died. I wish that people could have seen through the left-wing hypocrisy that is embedded in our mainstream media and our governments without having months and months of nationwide destruction. We shouldn't say, "Thanks, George." We should say, "Thanks, radical leftists, for being you." You do what you do, not because you believe in the causes, but because they are a means of power in your quest to become the totalitarian fascist that you are. The George Floyd riots opened a lot of eyes to that fact, and in doing so saved far more lives than you will ever know. It just wasn't the lives of people that you cared about. Because if you had cared, you would have stood by the average Americans who are watching their lifeblood being crushed for a disease that could have been easily manageable simply by protecting the most vulnerable and leaving everyone else the hell alone. Instead, you did the opposite. 4 years later, Trump was reelected. Don't think for a minute that there isn't a connection. Thanks for watching. I am the Philosopher King 2.0. Like and subscribe and find me on X and Telegram. Links to everything are in the description.